Right, welcome everybody. My name is Alex Pine. I'm with Citris, and today it's my pleasure to introduce the Research Exchange Seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to do a couple announcements on behalf of Citris and welcome our web viewers. On October 3rd to 5th, we'll have a phenomenal event called CalHacks. It's one of the first university-based hackathon. It already has 6,000 applicants. It will be in Memorial Glade, so if you're excited about this, apply online. It's calhouse.io. Also, another announcement for October 9th, we will have the Big Ideas information session, and that will lead to the Big Idea contest. So that's if that's of interest to you, that's on October 9th, 6:30 to 7:30. And then another two announcements. On October 27th, we have a fairly large meeting for Horizon 2020. A lot of you probably know about this large-scale funding effort from Europe, which is apparently opening to the US in this cycle. So on October 27th, we'll have a meeting. You need to register if you want to attend, so do this online on the Citris website. And finally, November 12th is the deadline for pre-proposals for this year's Big Ideas RFP. So with this, it's my great pleasure to introduce Paul Waddell, the chair of the City and Regional Planning Department. Paul is really famous and known for the model UrbanSim that he developed and that has really taken a lot of his work over the last couple of years and which has been used by many organizations, in particular MPOs, Metropolitan Planning Organizations. And his work has focused on various topics, but in particular the assessment of impact of land use regulations and transportation investments on outcomes such as spatial patterns and real estate. So I hope you join me in joining this seminar, and I really hope you'll show some great movies, because usually that's a fascinating part of your talks. Please join me in welcoming Paul.
All right, thank you very much, Alex, and welcome everyone. Hope you enjoy your leisurely lunch while we chat about big data and big cities. So I'm going to talk about two topics that I haven't seen blended very often in the past, but in the last couple of years, I guess big data has become a big topic, and all kinds of themes are getting appropriated under that term. So we'll look a bit at the intersection of the themes of big data or data science and big cities, mainly through the lens that I've been working on for some years, as Alex mentioned, urban informatics, urban simulation, and more recently, visualization. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes at the front end talking about big data and in the urban context and some examples of it to position the work that I'm doing within that space. And then I hope to spark a little conversation with some research questions and challenges, and then talk about leveraging big data and data science for urban planning, mainly through the context of urban modeling that I've been involved in and the visualization work. Just briefly by way of context, I direct an urban analytics lab that is in the College of Environmental Design and works on urban informatics, visualization, simulation related topics. And I've been trying to engage in collaborations across campus because there are so many other related activities. And I'll just mention quickly in passing a new grant from the MacArthur Foundation that focuses on this theme of integrating data science and simulation. I'll also put in a plug for a course that I launched last year and I'm teaching again this semester. I see one of my students out there. That is on urban informatics and visualization, where I'm trying to expose students heavily in planning, but also it seems to be drawing from other departments pretty broadly to open data, data science, basic programming for students that haven't been exposed to it before, and using those to leverage visualization and analysis. So briefly, some examples here of data science, big data, and urban context. Many people immediately jump to thinking of social media data when they think of big data and cities. And this is an example of some interesting visualizations that have been done by Eric Fisher, who mines geotagged tweets among various other social media data and makes some interesting inferences, like differentiating where locals are and where tourists are concentrated based on their geotagged tweets. He's also done some interesting work to infer hotspots for walking based on doing some deductive analysis with geotagged tweets. So that's kind of a common conception that people have about big data in cities and the connections between them. Another, to pay respects to Alex Bayan right here, is the Mobile Millennium Project and various further excursions along this line that take sensor data, cell phone data, and use it for informing operational routing decisions, navigation systems, and so forth in real time. And so this again conjures up the use of massive sensor data, a kind of very near-term time frame or immediate time frame relevant to traffic and routing decisions. I'll give a couple of other examples that may position us in a little different way. A lot of people probably don't think of census data as big data, but it's pretty big and messy data. And people are doing interesting things with visualizing it. In this case, a dot representing every single person in the country, and color coding with different, in this case, ethnicities, but also incomes and other attributes. Some interesting forays into examples of big data here. Another one is, many of you witnessed the sort of, shall I say, less than stellar rollout of the 3D Apple Maps. They came out with this product a while back, and one of the innovations was 3D textured surfaces of buildings. So from a distance, it looks really good. But if you zoom in very far, it looks like stretched facades of buildings and looks kind of clunky. But a lot of commercial companies, including phone companies, are, of course, getting into various applications of big data, including 3D visualizations. Another kind of big data is crowdsourcing, or another application. This is OpenStreetMap. How many of you have encountered OpenStreetMap as a project? Most people have by now. That's great. So it's kind of like Wikipedia, but the content is map data. And it's amazingly self-organized and productive, and has made amazing progress over the last few years as a crowdsourced project. So those are just a couple of touch points that I'll use to position the work that I'm doing that intersects that space. So now I'll segue a little bit into framing a few questions and having you engage in a little thinking about different kinds of questions that we might try to use big data to help us answer about cities. So, for example, how traffic conditions are evolving in real time. Alex's project is a good example of how those kinds of questions can be answered. What about which activity locations are most active and when? What parts of, what times of the day and where? Also seems like something you could pretty easily answer with big data, geotagged tweets and so forth. What about how social groups cluster spatially? That seem like something you could do with big data? Any nodding heads? No? Yes? Okay. So that seems like something you could probably get at. What about which neighborhoods are gentrifying? That is, turning over from low income to high income. People being displaced from those neighborhoods. Maybe a little more murky here. You could probably get access to some Redfin listings, Craigslist rental listings and so forth, and make some inferences. What about why those neighborhoods are gentrifying? It's a little more problematic, isn't it? When we start talking about causal relationships, it starts to get a little bit more strained to think about how we use big data and data mining and machine learning kinds of strategies, which are often based on making inferences from large volumes of data for which we observe all the relevant patterns, and we're making predictions within that space. But in planning, we're often asking counterfactual questions. We're asking, what if we change the zoning here? What if we change different policies that apply to a neighborhood? How will that change outcomes? And it becomes a little less clear whether standard data mining techniques, machine learning techniques, can really help us on their own address those. So I leave that as a kind of motivating set of questions to think about why, in some cases, we might want to blend a more theoretical and structured approach with a more data-driven big data approach. And I'll use this to paint a little bit of a conflict, if you will, at least some tension between historically developed urban models that were very theoretical, They weren't very grounded in data at all. And examples of this were the monocentric model that theoretically describes the concentration of activity in the center of the city and lower densities and lower prices as you move away from the center. Early agent-based models also were very theoretically driven, not very data grounded. We evolved, I think, later into models that were driven by theory, still very grounded in theory, but were calibrated using what I'll refer to as small data sets. Survey data, various kinds of auxiliary data that can be used to calibrate such models. So examples of that would be a gravity model or a spatial input-output model. And then more recently, models have been informed by theory but make use of very large, messy data sets. And it's that space in which I've been working pretty heavily developing the UrbanSim model platform. So it's very grounded in data, but it also has a theoretical foundation. Some people go farther to say we don't really need theory anymore and all we need is big data, and I guess I don't subscribe to that. What I am interested in is this hybrid of using some theoretical structure and big data or data science. I think using a modest theoretical structure that enables counterfactual analyses, that enables us to do policy analysis and explore what if we change the roadway infrastructure or change the transit level of service or intensify zoning around transit. How does that change outcomes? How does it change the way people react to and act within cities? So to do that, we still have to engage in solving some problems that are big, messy problems that colleagues working on machine learning, data mining, and other data science techniques can help us with. We have very messy data. Now, maybe urban data in terms of millions of parcel records and building records and employment records isn't considered big data by transactional clicks on Amazon or some standards such as that, or even sensor data for the roadways, but it's still quite voluminous and messy. And we often need to understand the structure of how that data interacts. So now I'll transition into discussing how we're attempting to leverage these kinds of data sets in modeling cities and their evolution over time. So UrbanSim is a platform that I've been working on for some number of years now. It's an open source software platform built mainly in Python. And most of the funding has come from the National Science Foundation. Although increasingly it's being used by planning agencies throughout the United States and elsewhere for operational purposes. The basic idea here is that we're trying to represent in a simulation framework how the real estate market works and how various agents in it make decisions, so modeling individual choices, and then how decisions made by governments in terms of regulating land in particular, and providing infrastructure influences those activities, those interactions between developers and households and businesses. These are some of the metropolitan areas that we have seen UrbanSim applied in operational use throughout the United States. And these are some research projects that it's been applied in over 70 countries that it's been downloaded in and used for usually research purposes. One example application is in Paris, where they're building a 36 billion or 37 billion euro Grand Paris Express around the perimeter of the region, and they're using UrbanSim to try to understand how the phasing of that implementation will influence the patterns of urban development around the perimeter of Paris and even in the central areas. Here in the Bay Area, we've used it in conjunction with the regional planning agencies to help support the development of the first Sustainable Community Strategies Plan, which was called Plan Bay Area. And this was mandated by state law in the form of climate change reduction legislation, AB 32 and SB 375. So I'll talk more about that project in just a minute. To situate this work academically, it obviously draws on a lot of prior work. It draws on various traditions in urban modeling. I mentioned some of the earlier urban economics work like the monocentric model. There have been lots of generalizations of that. One of Berkeley's own, Daniel McFadden, pioneered random utility theory and discrete choice modeling. We're obviously leveraging that pretty heavily. Guy Orcutt invented the approach of microsimulation, individual representation of agents and the choices and outcomes they experience. The proliferation of data and tools to process spatial data, geographic information systems in particular, began emerging in the late 80s, early 90s, and we're drawing, again, very heavily on that. Big data has really just come onto the scene in the last few years and is heavily beginning to inform what we do and how we do it. So again, just to further position this work, a lot of prior work was very aggregate in nature to represent cities. It represented representative agents of different kinds. So employment of different sectors, households of different income quartiles, for example, were all grouped together into a category. And geography was represented usually with a small number of very large geographic zones. And so the city was abstracted to a small number of zones and a small number of types of agents. What we're doing in UrbanSim is representing every single person, job, household, business, parcel of land, and building, and how they're all interconnected on the street network. There's another dimension to this in which we're also disaggregating or further differentiating, and that is that a lot of prior work has been equilibrium in its theoretical structure. So I think of representing a city as a game of musical chairs, where you change something, throw everyone out of their chairs, and force them to relocate, as though cities were instantly malleable in that way, which clearly they're not. There's a lot of historical inertia, historical architecture, historical infrastructure that shapes the way cities evolve over time. So representing time explicitly and dynamics and path dependence is another thing that differentiates this work. So how this takes form in model structure is that we're representing all these different agents explicitly as actors making choices, and then we're trying to model in terms of households, their restructuring over time as households age, kids leave home, households form, and so forth. How they respond in terms of choices they make about where they live and work, vehicles, how many vehicles they own, participation in the labor market, and so forth. And then how they make travel behavior choices, where they travel, how many trips they make, how they chain those trips, whether they're taking transit, walking, biking, etc. So without getting into too much detail, we're doing essentially the same thing for businesses, and we're also representing the role of real estate developers in terms of how they make choices about where to build, where to redevelop, and how real estate prices help to rationalize the market, if you will. Again, this is probably the most detailed slide I've got, which is just to try to encapsulate the mathematical logic of the models. These are discrete choice models in which we have choosers, say households that are deciding to relocate in the housing market, making a choice, and they're choosing between different housing options in different locations, whether they're renting or owning, whether they want to live in a single-family house or an apartment or a condominium, and in different neighborhoods across the city or across the region. And so we can evaluate the probability distribution of those options for them based on their own characteristics like income, stage of life cycle, how many persons there are in the household, and so forth. And how those attributes of the choosers interact with attributes of the alternatives, like the prices, the accessibility, the amenities in different locations. And so we're ultimately analyzing how people are making trade-offs between options, given their own underlying preferences and their budget constraints. And then we're generating a simulation of that set of choices from a probability distribution and simulating that over time. We do use a lot of data. This is just a listing of some of the data that's used in formulating these models. Getting this data together is a lot of work. For developing a model in a particular metropolitan area, it probably takes, used to take 2 to 3 years to get the data to a point that it was usable. We're hoping that with more intelligent data mining techniques, we can get this down to a much more automated process and generate much more robust data inputs. And particularly to solve issues of longitudinal data analysis. So we want to be able to observe how cities are changing over time from a historical period to today, and then at the margin, how they're changing as we can observe transactional data. So in the end, what we create is a connected graph of all these agents and units of geography and how they connect to physical built form. So jobs and persons connect to businesses and households, which connect to buildings. Buildings are associated with parcels, and parcels are associated with this entire street network infrastructure, as well as with hierarchical units of geography like blocks and cities and various zones, and then ultimately up to the region. So I'm going to give you just a little flavor, not very much, but a little flavor of some of the issues that we encounter as we deal with things like parcel data. These data come from individual counties. They're messy. They have a lot of data errors in them and missing data in some cases. So we find that we have to do quite a bit of work to integrate the data, synthesize it, reconcile disparate data sources. And there are enough different problems that the number of permutations on what could be wrong is incredibly challenging. So we've tried to do some work beginning to tap data science, just very, very preliminary work. Many people in this room probably have done more sophisticated things, certainly than what I'm about to show you, but the idea was to begin detecting errors in the data and imputing missing values, dealing with both continuous and discrete variables. So this is showing some data from parcels in the Seattle region, the Puget Sound, in which close to 200,000 out of 1.2 million parcels had a key variable building type missing. So we were missing a large fraction of the key identifier for what type of building it is. And that's not a small problem. So how might you solve the problem? Well, you might say, all right, let's say we're missing a particular parcel and what type of building it is, and maybe its square footage. But we can make inferences from what's around it, right? So often we know from geography that things close to each other are more similar. So we might try to tap the correlation spatially between things and generate a probability distribution from the surrounding buildings and impute something. But we probably wouldn't predict that we have a very large building there if we did that. Obviously, this is a hand-selected example, but you can imagine many such examples as we try to mine messy data and impute missing values. So I'm going to just skim through a couple of these things. We have started using things like k-nearest neighbor to help us predict things like stories and building square footage, drawing on localized sets of data. We've also tried to use support vector machines to help us classify data into categories that help us identify whether the data is correct or not, and have been able to do some, I think, moderately productive work so far, and using that to help us explore ways of improving data quality. But there's a long way to go here, and if anybody's motivated to help out, please come and talk to me after this talk. So again, I mentioned that the UrbanSim software is open source. We've re-engineered it just in the last 6 months to take advantage of a data science stack that Fernando Perez was one of the main creators of the IPython library, and I think many of you probably that do any work in data science have used these kinds of techniques. We've been putting a web front end onto this to make it easier for people to interact with. So using an R-like syntax for expressing models and being able to estimate them interactively on the web. Being able to run simulations on the web and then evaluate results, at least in fairly interactive map form at this point. So those are kind of a quick set of points about where we are with the software development and some of the challenges that we faced in doing it. I'm going to talk for just a couple of minutes about the tools, some additional tools that we've been building to try to accelerate this work and make it more expressive. One of which is to tap some work on algorithms for very fast routing decisions, like the Google router. If you've done trip planning and you can drag an intermediate route, it uses a technique called contraction hierarchies. And we've leveraged that technique to try to make it easier to very, very rapidly compute localized accessibilities. So here we're changing the slider of how far to grow the query out along the network And we can query all kinds of things, whether it's the average rents in the neighborhood or the total number of coffee shops you can reach within a certain amount of time, or any number of other attributes. Computing things like walk score is very straightforward and trivial to do in just milliseconds using that approach. So now I'm going to give you just a really quick tour, I hope, of an applied project here in the Bay Area in which we've used UrbanSim to support the regional planning process, where the goals are to reduce greenhouse gas emissions abruptly from historic trends. That sharp downward shaping, trending red line there is the policy objective as compared to historical trends, which are growing fairly monotonically upwards. And I would describe this as equivalent to a paradigm shift from focusing on moving vehicles to focusing on accessibility and letting people engage in activities without having to go very far or on a major highway to do it. And the state law is kind of catching up with this. California has just eliminated the level of service as its metric for environmental or CEQA conformity in favor of reduction in vehicle miles traveled. So there's a real shift in policy towards this paradigm shift that I've suggested. To summarize then, the inputs to UrbanSim are a lot of different policies in addition to macroeconomic drivers. So we're looking at transportation policies of various kinds in conjunction with land use policies that are principally the domain of local governments. So these are policies that are actually being put into play by a lot of different entities, not all of whose interests are mutually aligned, I might add. And then we're simulating the outcomes in terms of land and development, demographics, economics, transportation, and environmental outcomes of various kinds. Often these are summarized in the policy process or planning process into benchmarks or indicators that are broadly adopted goals for the planning process. So in the Plan Bay Area process, they grouped these sets of goals into three broad categories. A triple bottom line description is what's often used for this to address the outcomes in terms of equity, environment, and economy. And they used UrbanSim in coordination with the activity-based travel model to make these kinds of assessments. And the process of doing the analysis involved kind of forming a jigsaw puzzle of policies and conforming several sets of policies together to create different alternatives and then analyzing each of those packages or scenarios with different policy bundles. In an environmental impact review process, there's always a so-called no project alternative. That's either a trend line or if we just keep going with the current policies, what would happen? So that's the no project column. The ultimately adopted preferred scenario is the next column over. And you can see the change in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions goes from a reduction of 8% to a reduction of 18%, which exceeded the target of 15% reduction. Some advocacy groups got involved in the process, and the business community and real estate developers organized this network of communities alternative, the second to the last column. And then a group of advocates around affordable housing and social justice and transit organized the last column, the equity, environment, and jobs alternative. And you can see they performed just about as well as the adopted preferred alternative. So quite an intriguing political process. And then ultimately, the agencies used the models to do project-level analysis of all the different roadway projects and transit projects in the whole process and assess them on two dimensions. The 10 metrics that I showed earlier, the equity, environment, and economy metrics, are the horizontal axis, and benefit cost is the vertical axis. So you can see which projects scored well on benefit cost, but didn't really move in the direction of the adopted goals, and which projects advanced the regional goals but were expensive relative to their benefits, or not. And then I'm going to close up with just a few comments now and a little visualization work. Part of the challenge in these kinds of planning efforts and modeling efforts is just understanding the data and the different scenarios being analyzed. So we began working recently on a tool called Urban Canvas to do visualization, three-dimensional representations of the built landscape, editing and scenarios, and to really facilitate the creation and maintenance of a shared database to support this kind of modeling work. So we're trying now to work with regional agencies and cities and counties to share data. It's remarkably difficult to access all this data. If you go to Orange County in California and ask for their parcel data, they will hand you an invoice for $300,000. Now, the state has declared that parcel data is now open record, so maybe that will change, but they'll say the cost of duplicating the data is $300,000 perhaps. In any case, it's been a challenge, and we're hoping to incentivize a more open data approach. I'm going to close with a few little graphics to show you some of the things we've been working on. One is an analytic engine combined with a 3D building simulator, if you will, visualizer, so that planners can look at what are the effects if we change zoning requirements like setbacks and height restrictions and floor area ratios and parking requirements. How does that affect both what can be built on a property and how does it affect the financial bottom line, whether it's financially viable to construct such a project. So we're hoping that this also creates another mode of exchange between community residents, developers, and cities that often are looking at things in very contrasting views. All right, so I'm going to show just visualization here real quickly from Urban Canvas, more from a data visualization perspective, looking here at parcel data with building footprints extruded and color-coded based on a set of indicators, which we can change very, very rapidly and explore the data. So it enables a user to very rapidly absorb spatial patterns in the data that would not be otherwise very easy to digest. It's set up as a client-server platform so we can navigate to any place on the planet. And if local data exists, we can load that local data up and visualize it. And then I'll go finally to this. We're beginning to try to move this in the direction of a collaborative platform that would allow community residents and developers and cities to interactively put in proposals, phasing of those proposals, evaluate their financial feasibility, evaluate their impacts on traffic, on greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth, and make it as easy as possible to do that without getting bogged down in the complicated technology that previously was the case. So to wrap up, what we've been trying to work on, and what I'm interested in doing, is trying to leverage data science and combine it in an interesting hybrid with urban modeling and visualization. And I think it has the potential to change urban planning research and practice to make it more participatory, more evidence-based, more agile, that's certainly a good idea, more democratic, and more open in terms of data sharing and open data standards and initiatives. So with that, I'll close and open it up for questions. Thank you.
We have time for a lot of questions.
Thank you. Is work being done to use big data to forecast the consequences of urban disasters?
It's a great question. It's a topic that comes up quite a bit. I was just on the phone a little earlier this morning with someone trying to pull together an NSF proposal on almost exactly that question, looking at machine learning, modeling and simulation such as this, and resilience in response to disasters, whether they're flooding events or earthquakes or human-induced disasters, but essentially the both organic and, if you will, moderated kinds of responses that we have through institutional response afterwards. Clearly, some people are working on the immediate time frame after a disruption, evacuation, routing, those kinds of concerns. Just given my center of gravity in research, I'm focusing a little bit more on the longer-term adaptation and what we do in terms of adapting and gradually rebuilding places. So it's a very relevant question and a very unanswered question as of now, but one I think that's ripe for some interesting research.
This might be a bit of a technical question. So I was wondering, as far as the runtimes and the timescales for these simulations, can you give a better picture for someone who hasn't used it yet, and also how that motivates what language you use, for example? So Python
Sure.
would possibly be slower, and if you've ever dabbled into like GPU acceleration of your simulations, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great question. So runtime is actually rather important. I'm surprised, frequently surprised by how patient planners have been to use models that take an incredibly long time to run. Many of the transport models that I have been exposed to and have had to interface UrbanSim with can take, in a bad case, can take slower than real time to simulate. So more than 24 hours to model a day. I don't really understand the point. Why not just observe the traffic if we're modeling it that slowly? But in any case, performance is an issue. Python, as you might surmise, as an interpreted language, is not known for speed, especially if you do loops. And so what we've done is use the scientific Python stack pretty heavily, the NumPy, vectorizing all the calculations and then speeding it up quite dramatically. So far we've done, I think, a pretty admirable job within the constraints of that environment. Runtimes for an area like the Bay Area that's quite large are on the order of a few minutes, that is less than 10 minutes per simulation year, which is pretty good to simulate 7 million agents making decisions about all the activities that we're modeling at this point. We have had some interaction with GPU processing, a little bit of interaction with John Canny and EECS to try to take a look at some of the tools that he's been working on. I'm very interested in exploring other possibilities. I think there are some opportunities for fairly naive parallelization since we have a lot of agents making similar decisions, but we also have to accumulate those and have feedback. So if a lot of agents are trying to locate in a particular neighborhood, for example, we need to drive up the housing prices as a consequence of that excess demand, and then that influences the utility and probability of locating there. So there's a lot of potential for iterating, and I think GPU programming is a very attractive possibility. Not all problems lend themselves to GPU formulation, and I think it's going to take some hard work to figure out which parts of the problems we're dealing with lend themselves to that style of solution. But again, if anyone is interested in working on any of those topics, I would love to talk to you. Thanks.
Hi, I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about the Plan Bay Area application.
Sure.
So you mentioned the sort of the objectives and the indicators, the monitoring indicators and the evaluation of the plan against those indicators and the different approaches. So a couple of things. So one, just if you could describe a little bit more what was UrbanSim producing those outputs? Was it producing it? Were other tools producing similar outputs, and how were they compared? And then second, what were in the running of it? What were the insights and the policy relevant insights that came out of that application? I was on the equity advisory committee for that process and informed some of the equity metrics.
Yeah.
And we were similarly very surprised by the similarity of the performance of the different scenarios. There were three common sense explanations. One, there's inertia. Two, these different scenarios really aren't very different, and in part because the discretionary component of the plans were so much committed work. So
right.
If you could sort of take all that.
Okay, I might try the short answer to it now, and then we could have a longer conversation, because you just unpacked a whole lot of questions, or potentially so. So the UrbanSim was not the only tool used. It was used in combination with the activity-based travel model that MTC uses, as well as the IMFAC model for generating emissions, and with regional economic inputs. So all of those things went into these analyses. I think there are all kinds of reasons why the variability between the alternatives wasn't larger. Some of them are technical, and some of them are policy. The policy ones, I think, were that there were so many constraints, as I think you've already alluded to, imposed on the range of what was considered plausible to even, put on the table for policy discussion. So more radical, if you will, policies were ruled out. Broader congestion pricing, for example, was not allowed to be considered. And so I think we could have had a more divergent set of policies there. Similar constraints applied to land use policies as well. So those things helped bound the range that we would experience from this. I think there were also some technical issues. The travel model and the interface between the land use and travel models, I think, was done rather quickly. I think the responsiveness is somewhat attenuated because of limitations in the way that was set up. And I think there's a lot more that could be done with fine-tuning of both the individual models and the connections between them. So, thanks. Yes?
Thank you for your talk. Two questions. One, much of the mitigation in California is going to come from building codes and energy efficiency regulations, and I'm wondering how you deal with those. Second question, do you have any aspects of material flows, particularly water?
Great questions. Future work and work for others, I think, mostly, but certainly haven't done anything with material flows. It's a great topic. If there's someone that's got a technology stack that we can couple to, that would be fantastic. I would love to have some discussions. I've had discussions with LBNL about energy flows and building energy modeling to complement the modeling of energy consumption from transport. But not all of that has been implemented. And I'm already forgetting your first question. What was it?
How do you deal with energy?
That was the first one. So yeah, I have worked with a doctoral student in the past that's done quite a bit of work on modeling energy consumption, and with another one that's done work on water consumption using site-specific characteristics, and that enables us to create models that simulate individual consumption at the site level and how it's influenced by things like changes in zoning and so forth. But there are no doubt many details in building codes that we're unlikely to get into just because of the variability and specificity of it and the difficulty of accessing that much data. But it's a direction that's, I think, quite useful to go.
Any other questions?
I'll just briefly comment. Thanks for the presentation today. The game development has gone so far so fast. And in a way, academics who are trying to be careful and cautious and credible are left in the dust. But there's a second side to that, and that is that eye candy, for its own sake, is not good science. And so somehow I guess it's not really a question, but I'm just pointing out that there's a tension in what you do, where you do need to attract the attention of observers and be impressive, but at the same time sort of stick to more the sciencey side,
exactly,
and, clarity and whatnot. So maybe you could address that briefly.
No, it's I appreciate that question. I interact a lot with planners and urban designers that use tools that I'll broadly categorize as scenario planning or sketch planning tools, and I have issues with that approach. It's very heavy on eye candy and very light on science. And the idea is, for example, you'll find tools that have a very nice visual interface that paint parcels and have high-level detail and very high level of visual appeal. But the modeling is essentially the user putting in a set of rules and making assumptions about which land use gets placed first, which one gets placed second, what weight to put on different things. There's no grounding in data in that process. I find those to be, or very little at most. So sometimes you'll see maybe a reference to an elasticity in a national paper, and then they appropriate that elasticity and use it for local application, and it really has no bearing in that particular context. So I do think there's a lot of tension there. I also think that there are probably some useful things to learn from game developers and game activity, whether it's the fast rendering and graphics that we can take advantage of, or in some cases user interface ideas that might make things more usable. But I'm firmly grounded in making sure that the models are as empirically robust as possible, and that we can do things like longitudinal validation and uncertainty analysis, so that when we run a simulation over time, we can compare what we're predicting to what actually happens. And the more we can take into account transactional data that's giving us new waves of information as that data becomes available, I think the better off we'll be in terms of continuing to ground the models and improve them over time. The visuals are definitely eye candy, but they can improve usability quite a lot. We found that data quality is probably the biggest impediment to improving the quality of the modeling work that we're doing. And sometimes data errors can lurk and not be seen until someone actually has this kind of visualization capability. It's a complicated and delicate set of issues that you've raised, and I think they're good points.
No more questions? Very good. Well, please join me in thanking our speaker again. Thank you.